What is up, guys? Welcome to the Ward Room. This is the Daily Ward, and this is my show every Monday through Thursday. This is a setup show for Sunday morning's live talk show, The Ward Room Live. So I come on here, I talk about the relevant topic of the week, and that way my monologue on Sunday show is not 20 minutes long. It's 5 minutes long. And we can get into the discussion and the debate. That's how this whole thing works. That's why I come on here Monday through Thursday and speak about the topic of the week. And this week, it's about capitalism and how to change it for the better. Now, my last two videos, I basically talked about how capitalism is changing for the worse, has the opportunity to change for the worse, but it has the opportunity to change for the better. And one of the things that I speak about a lot is dismantling the Federal Reserve banking system. Now, there's a lot of good things that come out of the Fed and the way that fractional lending works. Great. There's a lot of bad things. Actually, a lot more bad than good. Specifically, and I'm going to cover this on Sunday's show a lot further into depth, but why we need to get rid of the Federal Reserve banking system. And I have a few written down here, so I'm going to be reading off of this pad. First of all, the best performing U.S. economy happened before the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, and that was between the years 1865 and 1913. So there was a lot of things that were not so good about that time and era. There was no centralized banking system. There were state and national banks that were not a part of a member group. That's what the Federal Reserve is, actually owned by banks. It's a banking system that controls money supply that's owned by banks. That is great. Fantastic. So just goes to show you, like, that's saying that you own your house, but your house pays you. You pay into the ownership that you own the house. Doesn't make any sense. You already own the house, but you're paying yourself into the house and you're using the house to create more wealth. It's fantastic how it works. It sounds crazy because it is. There's forever inflation. There's a control on the money supply. Now, I don't necessarily disagree with forever inflation because having a targeted interest rate is good, because it expands the money supply, it expands GDP, it expands wealth in the nation. But there's better ways to go about doing it than what the Fed does, which is targets interest rates with open market operations. Speaking of open market operations, it's a perpetual debt machine, the Federal Reserve is. The Federal Reserve is a perpetual debt machine for the U.S. government. If you don't know how this works, the Fed buys U.S. government bonds. Most people think that the U.S. Treasury prints money, and they do print cash. They print the paper money, right? They don't print the zeros on the screen. The Federal Reserve buys the U.S. government debt and exchanges it for money. So it's a fail-safe, basically, for the government, that it can never fail. The government can never fail because it will just print bonds which have value that's basically placed on the taxpayers of the United States. That's our good earnest deposit is your tax dollars. Isn't that great that the U.S. Treasury is printing debt, future debt, based on your behalf, your ability to pay them, the IRS, in the future? Doesn't that sound great? We have a AA credit rating. So that's a little sketch. That's like saying I'm going to use my neighbor's ability to pay me to print debt on my behalf, but I'm using my neighbor's money to pay me to pay the debt. I'm not using any of my own money that I generate. That's really how it works. The neighbor's the tax dollars in that example. So it's it's asinine that we've been doing this for over 100 years. It's crazy to me. Most people don't understand economics, especially macroeconomic theory, central banking. People don't know how it really works. They think the government just prints money, can do whatever it wants, and that's not the case. The government prints debt. The Federal Reserve buys the debt from member banks that go to auction. It's really anti-free market capitalism because we have an enclosed group of banks that charge their customers interest, but the interest that they gain, which is their revenue, goes for paying into the Federal Reserve System. Now, the Federal Reserve has what's called reserve requirements, which all the banks that are members have to keep a certain amount of their assets on the Federal Reserve's books. This prevents over-lending practices. This prevents the bank from hoarding too much cash so they could grow bigger and bigger, which happens naturally anyway, because if you own a few banks and you're a member of the Federal Reserve System, or you're not, doesn't really matter actually, other banks can come in and buy you if you have profitable operations. If your banking spread at your branches is in the plus, it's in the black, you could sell your bank to other banks. That's what's happened in the United States in the last 30 years. You've had these big banking conglomerates. The Federal Reserve creates bubbles and busts artificially. We've seen this. Look, one of the reasons I'm coming on here and talking about this is because you see President Trump, who appointed the Federal Reserve Chairman, Jerome Powell, get all up in arms because he's not doing what the Federal Reserve wants. And the Federal Reserve doesn't have to act on any political pressure or, it's independent of anything that the executive branch says, Congress says, the judicial branch says. Now, the members are appointed by the president and Congress, the members of the Federal Reserve System. There's chairmen. There's 9 districts, I believe. I think, is there 9 or 12? Anyway, but they act independently. It's an independent system. It's not a federal government system. It's actually privately owned. That's another reason why it needs to be abolished. It creates bubbles and busts by... they have a couple different ways that they change the inflation rate in the country, and they target a certain inflation rate based on their open market operations. The open market operations is where they buy and sell government assets. They buy and sell bonds, but they go to auction. The bonds go to auction. The Federal Reserve member banks have first pick of the bonds, the U.S. government debt. The U.S. government pays the banks to stay basically in operation on the good faith of the taxpayer, of the American people. It's insane. It's privately owned. I've already explained that. It's privately owned by the banks that own it. There's 38% of banks in the United States, mostly national and state banks, are member banks to the Federal Reserve. There's a lot of credit unions and smaller lending bank practices that are not a part of the Federal Reserve Bank. But that number grows every year. It may be more than that now. I'm not really sure. Last time I checked, it was 38%. They favor too big to fail banks, right? We saw this. They've done a lot of bailouts, actually. The Federal Reserve has bailed out all the big banks, not just AIG, Bank of America, JP Morgan Chase, Goldman Sachs, all the banks. Any bank that you can think of has been bailed out tremendously, and a ridiculous amount of money too. Citigroup, $2.5 trillion. Morgan Stanley, $2 trillion. Merrill Lynch, $1.9. Bank of America, $1.3. Barclays, Bear Stearns, Goldman Sachs, Royal Bank of Scotland, JP Morgan Chase, Deutsche Bank, UBS, Credit Suisse, Lehman Brothers, Bank of Scotland, PNB Paribas, which is a French bank, Wells Fargo, Dexia, Wachovia when it was in existence, Dresdner, It's just ridiculous. It goes on and on. All other borrowers, another 2.6 trillion. It's really ridiculous how this whole system is propped up on just basically the good faith of the American people, and we're getting kind of screwed by it. Bailouts to those banks, I already mentioned that. It pays banks not to lend money by keeping reserve requirements. They've gone up. They stayed up. The Federal Reserve has really a terrible track record, especially going in leading up to the financial crisis, 2008, 2009. Just an epic failure on the Federal Reserve's part. The one good thing that came out of that was they had to have QE to stimulate the economy. They had to bail out all these banks. That was not good. The banks should have failed and shut their doors. And the government, which is, will pay it out, whatever the FDIC costs were that were insurance, which you pay into because the member banks pay into it anyway. Now, you probably would have lost a lot of money, but that's the gamble that you take when you're investing your money into a banking system that's not controlled by any entity. It's privately owned. And it's not accountable. The Federal Reserve is not accountable to the American people. They can do what they want. They can target any interest rate they want. They can switch around reserve requirements however they may please. They can move assets around on their balance sheet however they may please. Any assets. Mostly it's banking assets, but they did have AIG, which is an insurance. Well, I guess it's a bank. Insurance on there, right? So, they could buy up land if they wanted to. Anyway, the whole reason I was coming on here to say this today is one of the things that I feel like that we need to change to make capitalism better. Capitalism is fantastic. It brings the most people out of poverty ever in the history of ever. It allows you to have free will and choice in your life to do what you want, to be able to create a life for yourself based on entrepreneurialism. And it's an amazing system that if was pure in its intentions, if human beings were pure in their intentions, then we would have a really good capitalistic system. If we cared more for each other, there wasn't a separatist mentality that exists from just an old world adage. I'm gonna soak up as much resources as I can because there's not enough to go around, and the more that I have, the more wealthier I feel, right? There's a keeping up with the Joneses. Now, I'm not talking about all of it's good because, there are detrimental effects to capitalism, but the presidential candidates that are running for office in 2020 want you to believe that capitalism is the wrong choice because they're so far into socialism, their ideologies now, that it's not good for any of the things I mentioned before. Freedom of choice. You have the freedom to choose how you want to live, what you get to buy. You get to vote with your dollars. You get to create a life for yourself, not stringent on any specific regulation. Now, there's a lot of the government regulations, and this is another point that I bring up a lot too. The government is the world's biggest business. The world's biggest business. It's up for grabs. These people want power and control. They do not have your best interest at heart. They will pander to you. A lot of their arguments don't make any sense whatsoever in any logical terms if you dig into what they say. They have a whole society of people, a whole half of the society, probably more, believing in bigger government is the answer. More incentives for the people is the answer. Printing money through modern monetary theory, which I've talked about many times, is not the answer. That's black hole economics. We need to abolish the Fed. We need to have a structured central banking system that has a targeted 2% inflation rate. That's a trickle inflation rate. If price, when I'm talking inflation, I'm talking pricing on goods, gets too high for people to afford, cost of living standards, and have disposable income that drives the economy. The economy is driven on disposable income. And companies and in people's houses. If prices get too out of control, you can turn off the trickle to the money supply that goes into the system. I'm not saying we have to completely dissolve the banking system. We just need to get rid of the member state, the member owned, non-state run Federal Reserve. A lot of other countries around the world, they have their own central banking system, and they've all reverted to black hole economics now. You know, the U.S. has been the piggy bank of the world for a long time, and it's time that we take our power back. I'm not necessarily one for having a complete separatist, isolationist view on the world. I think we all need to work together. The borders are pretty much, imaginary lines that people believe in. So it's this isn't an easy thing to solve, and we've been born into the system. We work in the system. We live in a system that's controlled by something that we have no control over as a people. The whole fabric of the nation, the United States, was built upon, having the ability to choose. That's your liberty. That's the liberty that you rightfully deserve, and it's a God-given right. Life, God-given. The pursuit to happiness, right? Those type of ideologies that exist because we have a constitutional republic have basically been disbarred by having this Federal Reserve Act of 1913 that's been in place for a long time. And that banking system is, it's a part of the BIS, the World Bank, IMF. It's just a hierarchical structure. So the people running for president, they want more power. They want the government to be bigger. We need the government to be smaller and actually govern. There are two very polarizing sides of that coin, and most people have given up on politics. They've given up on it to the point where they don't pay attention to it. It hurts their ears. When people talk about it, it's not politically correct to talk about politics. Go figure. You can't even talk about your ideologies and ideas anymore without people getting all butthurt. So there's a lot of things that we could change, and I've said it yesterday and the day before, nothing's going to change until people change. And they change in here, and they start living here more. But living here more doesn't mean we need more government control and more stringent regulation and pricing controls and rationing, and the list goes on and on. Destroying full industries that are in place that drive the economy. So there's no easy answer to this question. I hope you show up to Sunday morning show. We're going to be debating this. Me and my co-host, Mr. Mike. It's going to be exciting. It's going to be a good debate. He's for government intervention into the free markets. I'm totally against it. So show up for that one. There's going to be live Q&A. And I'll see you all there. This has been the Daily Ward. I'll see you all tomorrow. Thanks.